Hey kids, cook real food. Katie Kimball here with the Healthy Parenting Connector, connecting parents who want to raise healthy kids with the experts who have the information they need. And I am so excited to, I am sure, create some new neural pathways today. I have a feeling today's guest is going to challenge some of my conceptions about feeding my kids. And I know she's got a lot to say. Dina Rose is here, and she's a sociologist, parent educator, and feeding expert, empowering parents to raise kids who eat right. Thank you so much for being here today, Dina.
It's my pleasure, Katie.
Great. So let me introduce the audience to you a little bit so they know where you're coming from. Dina is the author of It's Not About the Broccoli, 3 Habits to Teach Your Kids for a Lifetime of Healthy Eating. And she's been training parents, pediatricians, dietitians, and early childhood educators in her habits approach, which we'll talk about, for the past decade. Now, that's after another decade of teaching and research in the field of children and eating. Her information's fascinating, and she's a sought-after speaker who I'm so honored to have as a guest today. She's a regular contributor to Psychology Today, and most importantly, she's a mom. So we'll jump right in. Dina, I'd love to hear your story because I've read a little bit about it, and it's very powerful how you got started getting interested in what kids eat and how kids eat.
Yeah, I love, well, I mean, obviously it started because I have a kid and she eats.
Yes.
And I wanted to know how I could teach her to have a healthy relationship with food. But really, of course, what framed all that was that I grew up in a home where my mother struggled all the time with her weight and her eating. And, she wasn't always heavy. Sometimes she was what we would think of in the completely normal range, but she was always, always struggling with food and weight. And towards the end of her life, she sort of lost that battle. And she died while I was pregnant with my daughter.
Oh, that's
and it was hard. And she definitely had complications from obesity, related illnesses, and she was over 300 pounds when she died, and she was only 65 years old. And so that happened while I was pregnant, and then my daughter was born, and I just was consumed with this question of how do you teach kids to have a healthy relationship with food, because I didn't want her to continue the legacy, of course, of her grandmother, my mother. I feel very strongly that my mother was able to help me not have the same struggles that she has, but we didn't finish the job. And I wanted to give my daughter a better leg up, let's say. And because I'm a sociologist, I knew just instinctively and professionally that the key to this was about habits. And that the first habit that I was concerned about and really paying attention to was not making her finish all the food on her plate, because the thing that I wanted most was to raise someone who could eat some cookies without eating the box, or eat some potato chips without finishing the bag. Things that I have a few problems with myself.
Okay.
So that's kind of where I started. But as I started to investigate this and feed her, but look at other moms making their feeding decisions, applying my sociological imagination, which is what we call it in the field, how are norms and values and behaviors and beliefs transmitted from parents to kids in the eating domain. And then, of course, I went back to the literature and I started reading what the science had to say and interviewing parents. And what I learned was what I had instinctively figured out first, which is that nutrition, which is all about the food, is not about the behavior. And that if you focus on creating the habits that you're interested in teaching your kids around food, that the nutrition will come along for the ride. But that if you focus on the nutrition, it's easy to teach the wrong habits. And so this model, what I call the habits approach, just grew and evolved, and it got more sophisticated and tweaked. And I have found over the years that sharing this with other parents, sharing it with pediatricians, they go, it's the Oprah aha moment. They just go, that makes so much sense.
Wow. You had such a powerful juxtaposition with, all those pregnancy hormones and then birth. And I think it would be really easy for a lot of moms to be, you said you were overwhelmed or consumed. You said you were consumed with digging in. And I think a lot of moms could be consumed with overwhelm instead and just like, oh, like give up and eat all the cookies. So I have to just commend you. And I love that you just took all of that emotion and all of that energy and shoved it into your work and your brain and, like figured this out for yourself and for the rest of us. So we appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, I would love to hear what do you see in other parents? Like, why do we tend to cause poor relationships with food when we try to teach our kids to eat healthy foods? Like you just said, the nutrition, like teaching about nutrition tends to be the wrong way. So here's where I'm going to
Right.
be challenged. Okay, I'm ready.
Yeah. Okay, it's going to be easier and better than you think. There's really let's separate it into sort of like two different kinds of issues. So one is that as parents, when it comes to feeding, we're thinking more about the food and how to get the food into our kids. And we live in a culture that is just obsessed with nutrition and with healthy eating. And we talk all the time to parents about getting their kids to eat fruits and vegetables, fruits and vegetables, fruits and vegetables. And we really kind of teach parents the idea that if they mess up, the life of their kids is at stake. Like this becomes the hugest thing that ever happened. And so, but we also have this belief that kids just naturally don't like healthy food. And so when you have the pressure to get healthy food into the kids, coupled with this idea that they don't like it and they can't like it, like they're genetically programmed not to like it, then you put the parents between a rock and a hard place. And so even though parents mostly know, like, don't bribe your kids to eat their vegetables, don't make them finish their plate, there's all these don'ts and parents know not to do them. But when I talk to them, especially in workshops, and you go like raise your hand if you've ever done this anyway. And of course, everyone raises their hands because if I have to get a few vegetables into my kid, then I'm going to do whatever it takes. And if it means telling them to eat half of whatever's left on their plate, or tell them they have to eat 2 more bites, or telling them that they can't get down from the table, or telling them they can't have their dessert, I'm going to do it because I want to be a good parent and I want my kids to eat those vegetables. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that because we live in this nutrition culture and we are consumed with the information about what you ought to eat, the discussion about, especially with regard to kids, but even with regard to adults, the discussion about healthy eating forgets that healthy eating isn't just about eating healthy food. Healthy eating is about eating for the right reasons, eating the right amount, staying in touch with your own hunger and your own fullness. So it's not just what you eat, it's why, when, where, how much. And our nutrition-based dialogue doesn't allow for that. And so we forget that these other issues are being taught. So I always tell people, for instance, that when my daughter was little and she was getting those vaccinations, and of course she would cry and the doctor or the nurse would whip out a lollipop, which is ironic in and of itself that the medical profession is giving out these lollipops, but let's leave that.
I might have some opinions about that. That's for another day.
But that's for another day. But I would always grab the lollipop and hide it, not because I didn't want her to have the lollipop, but because I wanted to hug her and comfort her while she was crying, because that is how to respond to emotion. And then when she was done and she had subsided in her sort of crying and her emotions and everything, and she was back to being her little child happy self, then I would give her the lollipop. So I'm not against the lollipop, but I am against the lollipop being tied to emotions.
Okay, interesting. So for you, and that's why you say it's about habits. So your book talks about 3 habits, and you've talked about the habit approach. Can you give us a little overview of what these 3 habits are and how they impact family life?
Absolutely. So the first thing I want to say is a caveat that I did not make these habits up. So it's important to know that the 3 habits that translate nutrition into behavior are proportion, variety, and moderation. And I'll come back to what those are in a second.
Mhm.
But I do want to say that, 10 or 15 years ago, when I was sort of noodling around on the USDA website because I wanted to know more about the food pyramid. Remember that old food pyramid, which was before the plate. I was on the USDA website looking at the history and sort of how the pyramid evolved. And what I came across was a page that talked about proportion, variety, and moderation as the principles that underlie the food pyramid. And it also said that these terms were really for educators and not for the general public. Well, I had my own, Oprah moment where I was like, oh my goodness, like 3 behaviors and this is what they are. And it was just like ding, 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 ding. And so that's where I started to investigate what those behaviors were, how to apply them. And what I learned is, if you think about the old pyramid, and who can remember 4 servings, 3 servings, 20 servings? Like, what is a serving? Is it a whole fruit or a half a fruit? Or if your child's little, is it a third of a fruit? Or is it a slice of bread or 2 slices of bread or half a bagel? I mean, who can remember what a serving size is?
You'd be doing math all day.
And if you have more than 1 kid, like, oh my goodness, right? So, I just couldn't believe it was proportion, variety, and moderation. So I started to talk to parents about these 3 principles. And what they do is they completely simplify what your goals are. And once you know where you're heading, it's pretty easy. Well, maybe it's not that easy, but at least we have a clear roadmap and it's very easy to know where you want to go. So for instance, proportion. Oh, and let me just say as an aside before we get into this, a lot of people use the word balance. As long as I have a balanced diet. And the reason I don't talk about balance is because balance is a word that can mean almost anything. So as long as, or moderation, right? Moderation is another word that gets used all the time. Like, as only as I eat in moderation. Well, does that mean as long as I only eat an entire cake once a month? That's moderation. Or is it if I only eat, a small portion every single day? Like, what's moderation? So proportion is eating healthy food more frequently than everything else. So it's really about ratios. And the thing I love about the concept of proportion is that it doesn't demonize the bad food. There is no bad food. And so if you look at the My Plate icon, this is one of my big beefs with that My Plate icon, is that there is no dessert on that plate. And by not putting a dessert on the plate, we are pretending that desserts don't exist. So without recommendations about how many sweets and treats you should put into your daily diet, like on that plate, we are actually leaving it up to whatever you want, right? And of course, that's not been working. And I always say it's kind of like pretending that you don't have a crazy old aunt in the attic. She's hidden up there. We can pretend she's not up there, but she is. So we might as well acknowledge it. So proportion does that. So proportion is just about getting the ratios right. Now, most of us parents feed our kids not from the healthiest end of the spectrum. We do what I call the at least diet, where we feed chicken nuggets and we say, well, at least it's chicken or at least it's protein. But when we use the at least diet, we're always sort of in our heads wishing, or our hearts more, wishing that we were doing a different diet if our kids would only allow us. So proportion just gets us aware of that. It shows us how to put the sweets and treats into a diet in a way that works, but it also encourages us, and I have some tips for this, but encourages us to sort of move in the healthier direction. But you can apply the principle of proportion to wherever your kids are today. So that's the first habit. Variety is the second habit. And everybody knows that their kids should eat a variety of food. The problem is that most parents think of variety as exactly the same as new foods. Like, how can I provide a variety of foods if my kids won't eat new foods? And so that, and variety really just means different, not new. And so we can also start variety wherever you are today. And a couple of thoughts I just want to throw in there, which is when most parents think of variety, they think of dinner. and they don't think about breakfast or lunch or snack. And so they tend to serve the same couple of foods at breakfast, the same couple of foods at lunch and snack. And actually, and if parents talk about when they're having struggles with their kids, it's always at dinner time, right? And if you say, well, how's breakfast going? They go like, breakfast is great. My kid loves breakfast food. So when we offer kids basically the same foods for every meal and snack except for dinner, if you think about habits, what we're doing is teaching them to expect monotony, that I eat the same couple of foods all day long except for at dinner. And then if you look at the kinds of foods, they're kind of all the same. So like pizza and cheese quesadilla and a grilled cheese sandwich and cheese sticks and mac and cheese, and they're all the same food. They're all cheese and bread. And so, and at the beginning of variety, right, that might be okay to rotate through them with something I call the rotation rule, which is just start using the foods that you already serve and sort of mix them up so that there's no food 2 days in a row. That is variety. It's not new, but it's different. So in the beginning, you might use all those foods, but after a while, you might start to look at the similarity of foods that seem different, but they're not. So that's variety.
Okay.
And the third one is moderation, but used very specifically to think about portion size, but not really portion size, but portion size, how it's tied to hunger and satiety, hunger and fullness.
Okay.
So if we're teaching eat the foods in the right ratios, and then we're teaching how to eat a variety of foods, I'll talk about new foods later, and then we're talking about hunger and satiety. We're also really kind of behind that, talking about eating because you're hungry and not because you're bored, sad, or lonely. So that gets the emotional eating category in there. It gets us conscious of the full range of behaviors that constitute healthy eating habits.
Okay. It all sounds so doable.
Well, three behaviors are so much easier to think of and keep your eye on that prize than, portions of fruits and vegetables and grains and stuff like that.
Sure. I had to notice that when you were talking about the middle one, no, the first one, proportion. You talked about eating healthy foods more than non-healthy foods. And I was like, oh, so somebody has to know about nutrition. Like at least the parents have to have an idea of what's healthy and what's not, or how, or you wouldn't know proportion. Like how do you help people figure out those categories?
Yeah. So all of us know the basics. Like everybody in America knows that carrots are not cookies. Like that's the basic. And you don't need to know about omega-3 fatty acids, and you don't need to know about antioxidants, and you don't need to know particularly about vitamin D, and you don't even really need to know about like grams of protein or any of that kind of like the woods of the nutrition. You just need to have the big picture, and everybody knows the basics, right? If you just think about it, like if knowing about nutrition led to healthy eating, we'd all be the best eaters on the universe, because there's never been a time in history when we knew as much about nutrition as we do now, and yet we still eat so poorly. So go to the basics, right? Just the big picture. Carrots over here, cookies over here. Everybody knows that like a baked chicken is going to be healthier than a fried chicken. Those kinds of really basic things. So where it gets muddied is in the middle. So I've just made these two polar categories over here. And in the middle is where it gets complicated. And that's where all the processed packaged food comes in. And we're not really sure if this box is going to be healthier than that box, and that's where, and it's confusing partly because it is confusing. And it's
right. Too many people think fruit snacks are fruit if they have fruit juices in them.
Right. So partly it is confusing. Partly it's confusing because the science behind nutrition keeps changing. And partly it's confusing because food manufacturers take advantage of the fact that it's confusing. And they market things as good enough that it'll pass the mom sniff test, but delicious enough that kids will eat it. And it just, it can be confusing, right?
Right.
So the thing to remember is that we can just put that middle category into a different way of thinking about it, right? Instead of, so what happens is most parents, when they're on the fly, just think about healthy and junky. You know, like they have more nuances, but on the fly, they just think about healthy and junky. If you just go to the third category model, where everything you're unsure of just gets dumped into that third category.
Yeah.
And in the healthy and junky model, the middle category always gets lumped with the healthy. But if we lump it with the junky, we're going to be better off. So
if in doubt,
treat it like a treat.
Proportion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But where, to the extent that you know what it is, just put it in less frequently than the other stuff. But of course, if you're living in the middle category, which is where parents of kids and all that child-friendly food lives, if you're living there, it's okay. Just start moving a little bit in the other direction.
Right. Incorporating more foods that you recognize that maybe don't have ingredients labels at all.
Well, and you have to understand that those middle foods, what they're doing is pushing your kids' taste preferences towards junky food. And that's why I lump them in with the junky food, even if they're not junky. So things that taste really sweet are going to train your kids' taste buds to prefer sweet foods. So where do your kids' taste preference get shaped? So I often tell people to do this experiment. I don't think anyone's ever done it because it's just so obvious from the setup. But if you do it out there, let me know. And I say, like, give your kids a bowl of oatmeal, an oatmeal or a granola bar, and an oatmeal cookie. And then play the odd one out game and say, you know, which one doesn't belong here? And it's obviously the bowl of oatmeal, because the granola bar and the cookie look the same. They kind of taste the same. And so it may be healthy, in air quotes here, but it's not as healthy as the bowl of oatmeal. But from a habits perspective, forget the nutrition. The oatmeal bar is going to push your kids to want oatmeal cookies, not oatmeal. And plain oatmeal is going to push your kids to like plainer flavors, and that's going to push you more towards fruits and vegetables. And especially with regard to sweetness, the thing is that sweet foods are so sweet, right? The idea that kids prefer bland and boring foods, that's a myth. Child-friendly foods are extremely salty. They're extremely sweet. They've got fat in them, so they've got that yummy kind of mouthfeel. And cantaloupe, no matter how sweet it is, cannot compete. You know,
poor cantaloupe.
Poor cantaloupe, right? A nice chicken dish cannot compete with chicken nuggets because it's not salty, it's not crunchy. So taste preferences really matter.
Gosh, that's so interesting. The granola bar story is funny because when I started teaching families how to be healthy and without going crazy 10 years ago, one of my early, like, super popular recipes was this granola bar recipe. And so people will still talk to me about it, like, oh, I love making your granola bars. And I feel a little guilty now because I'm just more cognizant. I mean, I know there's a cup of honey in the granola bars, and I'm like, oh, that's nice that you're making them homemade. Like, but yeah, I should say, like, have you thought about oatmeal? Because I know they're cookies. They're cookies in a bar shape. They're really yummy.
Well, yeah. And here's the thing. There's nothing wrong with eating the granola bar. And if eating what I call the healthified foods instead of the junk makes you feel better, fine, do it. But don't call it healthy to your kids. Call it even in the middle. Just sort of call it fun food or something. Or I mean, fun food, which is the way I labeled it in the book. And someone recently pointed out to me, I can't believe it didn't occur to me, by calling it fun food, we're actually priming kids to think of it as better than like healthier growing food, because don't we all want some fun? But you know what I mean? And so you're allowed to have it. And if healthifying that food makes you feel better, go for it. But if your kids prefer the cookie, I'd say go for that too. I wrote a blog post on my blog, It's Not About Nutrition, a long time ago, and it's still the most controversial blog post I ever wrote, which was, I made the argument that donuts are better for your kids than muffins.
Ooh.
Because there's not a person on the planet who tells their kids that donuts are healthy.
Right.
And so when we put donuts into the diet, we tend to put it in the way that is a better, healthier diet. Remember, healthy eating isn't just about eating healthy food. And when we give them muffins, which very often are really just renamed cupcakes, and they tend to be big, like they're bigger than your kid's head. We're teaching them that they're healthy. And that's going to mess with their minds. And also, who doesn't love a muffin? I mean, right?
Because they're a cupcake without the frosting, really.
And they push your kids' taste preferences in the wrong direction. And the reason it's the most controversial post that I've ever written is because there are all these parents out there who write and say, well, my muffins are full of flaxseed. Well, my muffins don't have any oil in them. They've got applesauce, or and I want to say kudos to you. I really mean it, right? And I love a muffin, and I make my own muffins sometimes, and we eat them. But from a habits perspective, getting your kids used to sort of the cakey, muffiny flavor, sweet, whatever it is, isn't going to help you out in the long run.
Interesting. So, I mean, what I really hear you saying is like, let's put foods in their proper place and in their proper category. So if something is a dessert or a treat, let's call it what it is, right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. And the nutrition environment, the nutrition dialogue, the culture of nutrition, nutritionism, boiling everything down to its nutrients, doesn't have a place for, and that's why I always air quote it, like these bad foods. And what happens if you think about this more extensively, of course, that leads to guilty feelings when you eat bad food. Like, who wants to pass on their guilt to their kids? One of the things I always say about Halloween, and Thanksgiving and all these holidays is that some of us, I'll raise my hand, certain sweets and treats, certain cakes and ice creams, if they're in the house, they call me. They go like, Dina, I'm here. Don't you want to eat me? Well, that's not a healthy relationship to sweets and treats, I just want to say. And by labeling all these foods bad, then people who eat them are bad. And so if your kids eat them, then they're bad. So that is one of the byproducts of nutritionism. And so let's just normalize the diet. Let's take the emotion out of it. You can love it and have it a sort of emotional, like I had the best dinner last night, that's fine. But let's take some of the emotion out of it and teach kids that muffins are fine, but they're cupcakes. Even if they're healthy, because the category of muffins, so you raise your children in your home on these fabulous, super duper healthy muffins. And then they get launched into the world where they go to the corner store and buy a muffin cupcake. And that's their habit. Every morning I I almost said cupcake. Every morning I have a muffin for breakfast. So that's a bad habit, right?
Okay.
And nobody does that with donuts. Even families who feed their kids donuts every single day are not telling their kids that that's a healthy breakfast.
Right. It's just a quick breakfast, or it's
right. Or whatever. It's the easiest one to shut you up or get us to school on time, or, or I've got a donut addiction, or whatever. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I have more questions, but I just have to ask about the candy thing. So what language do you use around candy?
So the most important thing that I want to teach my daughter, who's now a teenager, so I'm kind of done with all this teaching stuff around food, but the most important thing that I always wanted to teach her was eat the candy that you love, not the candy you have. So if and that applies to cookies and, ice cream and whatever, like don't just eat it because it's there. That's one thing. The other thing is you have to know what is a right amount of candy or sweets and treats to be put into the diet on a daily basis. And that's why I wish that the My Plate icon had a cookie on it, because a visual of how little that cookie is in comparison to the plate would both say it's okay to eat it, but it would also start teaching kids what that amount is. And so that's one of the reasons I recommend parents be explicit about sweets and treats, and also what constitutes a sweet or a treat. So in my home, when my daughter was little, those sweetened yogurt tubes, which have more sugar per ounce than Coca-Cola,
Yes, I know. Say it. Preach it, sister.
were sweets and treats, right? You could have them, and we kept them in the freezer actually because it was kind of like ice cream, and she loved them that way. But you can have that, or you can have the cookie. Like that doesn't fit into the healthy food category. But what most families do is that the parents are kind of winging it, which I understand. And so kids will want a sweet or a treat, and they'll say, "Can I have this?" And parents do this mental check, like, how much has Bobby had today? And then I say yes or I say no. But the problem with that approach is that it doesn't teach Bobby anything other than this is like an anonymous decision. It's ambiguous. I don't really know where it's going. I don't know why she says yes sometimes and why she says no sometimes. And anytime it's ambiguous, it invites the child to beg and whine and barter.
Oh,
Right?
sure. Oh, yeah, because they have no idea. All they know is I have to ask about this thing, and we'll see what answer I get.
That's right. And sometimes if I plead, I get it. So if we get clear with our kids and we say, let's say, and in my house, we sort of had, we always had a treat drawer, which had really the there's no language in our society for like the worst offenders, like the real sweets and the chips and all that kind of stuff. And she could go in the drawer. I think we had a rule of like once a day. And then there were these middle treats like the yogurt and the juice and all this kind of stuff. She could have one of that sort of category once a day. And we weren't rigid about it. And I didn't have a list like, this is what is in the middle category and this is, but we sort of played it by ear, and she understood the concept of it. And she could have those whenever she wanted to, whenever it was a time to have a snack or a meal. And so I set the parameters, the overall structure, and then she had control within that. And she also knew explicitly what the decision rule was. And so it eliminated the fighting. When I tell parents about this, they get scared that their kids are going to sneak more of the sweets. And I want to say, well, that actually is either a behavioral problem, like an honesty issue, and you need to work on that as opposed to control the food. In fact, it would be better for you to continue to let the food be out there and keep working on that issue, because ultimately trust and honesty is a more important life lesson for kids than whether you have an extra, candy in a day. So I would say that. But it's also a sign that kids have felt a little bit starved for their sweets and treats, or they feel a little bit insecure about whether they're going to be able to have more. And that's why we don't want to be overly controlling of it.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, I want to throw out a couple of the phrases that we use in our house and get a little report card from you.
So They're all great. Perfect.
No. We got to be honest here. We do say one dessert a day, and we do have they all have their own little tub with candy in it, and it does have to fit. I say if it overflows, you got to get rid. And then we talk about, I hate the dessert after dinner question because it's so tricky. Like if they've eaten nothing, I always say, well, you didn't eat much, so your dessert cannot exceed the amount of food you ate, right? Dessert can't be bigger than dinner. Is that okay?
Yeah.
That proportion?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I love the idea of like a container or something that each kid has, partly because if you've got more than one child, I only have one child in my house, so she didn't have to worry that her siblings were going to go into her stash. And so a lot of insecurity around these things happens because siblings can steal food. And I want to say, as the youngest and the only girl in my family, my brothers could out-eat everyone. And so, especially with sweets and ice cream and, and I had that, right? I had that insecurity.
Yeah.
So I love that you have that. And I love even that it's like, if it overflows from that, then you got to get rid of something. I think that's okay too. At Halloween, I have a little different about whether or not you should get rid of it, because I think that has so many underlying bad lessons. But I think I love that approach. The dessert issue It's so tricky.
It's so hard.
It's so tricky. So here's what I want to say, which is most days, dessert should just be the second course or the third course if you have like a salad course or something. I mean, we did that with salad, by the way. We had salad at the table when there wasn't any other food there. And we would pick out the tomato or the cucumber that she wanted from the salad and while we had a salad, because I wanted to make that a habit. And I didn't want any competing foods at the table at the same time. And I also didn't give her a serving of the salad. I just gave her the things she wanted because over time that shifted, right? So I had 3 courses. I had the salad and then we had whatever we were having for dinner and then we had dessert. But most times the dessert was just another course. It was fruit. I mean, in my house, it was almost always fruit, but it could be cheese and crackers like the Europeans do, or it could be plain yogurt with a sprinkle of something on it or something like that. And the reason I did that was twofold. One is that I wanted her to learn that dessert doesn't have to be sweet, but it also enabled her to, I would always know that there was like a backup built in. So if she didn't eat a lot of dinner, sometimes she would just go to town on fruit at the end of dinner. And then I knew she'd eaten well. And sweets as a dessert only happened occasionally. And so that solves the problem of what happens if they're not eating enough dinner, right? That's that. But I also believe, and I think that what you're saying is a good thing about like eating dinner is not the gateway to dessert. So eating some broccoli does not offset the sugar in whatever the sweet dessert is. And so we should not tie things together. We shouldn't pair them together, especially, well, we don't want that emotional pairing. Oh, I ate my dinner. Now I get to have a big dessert. Like, that's not a great lesson.
Yeah, good point. Darn, I knew that would be challenging, but that's good. That's good.
But the other thing is that we don't want to teach kids that you always eat dessert on a full stomach. And so if I come to the dinner table and I'm not that hungry, or I don't really like that food and I don't really want to eat it, which, you know, that's a mixed blessing, right? You want to teach your kids not to eat food just because it's there, but of course it's dinner time and you don't want them to keep asking for food later on. So that's a tricky thing and we can talk about that separately. But if a child comes to the table and like for whatever reason doesn't really want to eat the food that's there, and then everybody's having dessert, I wouldn't say, well, you can't have dessert. And so I actually love your idea that it has to be a small portion. But I would say that even if they'd had dessert, it should be a small portion. So that shouldn't be contingent on how much you ate at dinner. Oh, I ate a big dinner. Now I can have a big dessert. Like dessert should always be, we want to teach kids what is an appropriate child-sized portion for dessert.
Okay.
And so if people are having dessert, everyone can have dessert. Now, if the child didn't eat dinner and then had a small dessert, that child might get hungry later. Well, that's a different issue and you need to solve it in a different way. But that's what I would say about dessert.
Interesting. So how should we teach our kids to use the phrases, I'm hungry and I'm full? Because those can be really manipulative, button pushing phrases for parents who know you're not full, you're just wanting to get down. And like, what are some ways that parents can respond appropriately and maybe some inappropriate responses you've heard over the years?
Right. So here's the thing, that children early on in life, when they're learning language, don't necessarily know what it means to be hungry and be full. So when we ask them, they're trying to marry the feeling that they have in their stomach with the words, right? And so they're going to get them wrong. So don't believe them early on. So are you hungry or are you full is something that we need to teach them. Just like my little daughter used to look up at me with her hands going down, down, because she wanted me to pick her up. And I would say, no, you mean up, up. So some of it's a language issue. But the other thing is, if we tell kids, well, if you don't eat, you're going to be hungry, and then we make them eat, they will never learn what hungry is, right? And if we make being hungry the gateway to sweets and treats, then they're going to lie about being hungry. And that's how come a child can say at dinner, I'm not hungry, and at dessert, I'm starving. Because they're just using what you've taught them as legal as a way to get what they want. So what I really recommend are what I call eating zones. And that means a sort of a loose structure of when there's food, but more importantly, when there's no food. Kids can eat during those eating zones, but they cannot eat in between those eating zones. And then they start to experience the natural consequences, and they start to learn about what it really means to be hungry and what it means to be full. But if we overimpose our ideas and what we know is going to happen, then they have a more difficult time learning that. There are other exercises that parents can do to actually actively teach hunger and fullness, but the structure, just like the rotation rule structure of mixing it up, the structure of having eating zones gives kids a place to naturally learn what hunger and fullness is. And for parents, most of us are afraid of our kids being hungry. So I just want to say, remember, with an eating zones structure in your home, there's always another eating opportunity coming around, first of all. Second of all, short-term hunger is not life-threatening, and we don't want to teach kids to be afraid of being hungry for a little while, which is what happens if they say they're hungry and we immediately scrounge for some kind of snack, even if it turns out we don't have a banana, so we give them some chips, right? So we don't want to teach them to be afraid of being hungry. And the third thing is that if you think about hungry as building an appetite, it makes it easier to kind of hang with it.
Okay, I like that. Hunger is building an appetite. That's awesome. Now, the hardest one, I think, is what do you say to parents who say, oh, like my kid is so picky. I've tried everything. Like eating healthy is totally impossible.
Yeah. So this is, we could do a whole podcast just on this topic. But I would say that start with the rotation rule of switching up what you serve, give within the range of foods that the child already eats, put in place the eating zone so that there's some structure, and then reevaluate where there's pressure. So just taste it if you don't like it creates pressure, because if I don't want to eat it, I don't even want to taste it if you're going to make me eat it, if I like it, which doesn't make sense to us because we think if you like it, you're going to want to eat it. But for kids, if they're stuck in that and they're scared, they don't want to eat it. They've already decided. So they put it in their mouths to be good, but they're not really tasting it. So the key there is to put the structure in place, remove the pressure, and start doing what I call exploration, which is why I have this Superfood Explorer kit. But it's take a pea-sized sample, poke at it, describe that, or compare which one is greener, this apple or this pea, or smush it and describe the texture. Anything that you do along those lines is going to start, relaxing the shoulders, relaxing the pressure, and will help those kids become adventurous in the long run. But it doesn't switch overnight. And there's more to it. It can be a little bit more complicated, but that's what I would say is a good place to start.
That's awesome. And so that Superfood Explorer kit, that can be found at your website at itsnotaboutnutrition.com, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's helpful. And it's that kind of thing. It's like just a structured way to teach kids to explore bits of food, touch them with their fingers, think about them with their brains.
Exactly.
Is it like everything but the mouth, basically?
Well, they can put it in their mouths and they can take a taste if they want to. But the thing is, we want to separate out exploring from eating. And so when we are doing it at the dinner table with the hidden, we always just say, oh, just taste it. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it. But we do not mean that, because deep down we're thinking, I hope you eat it. Please eat it. Please eat it. And then when you don't eat it, we are disappointed or angry or any other kind of response, because I just spent 3 hours in the kitchen, or I've been trying to get you to eat this for 3 weeks, or,
and
it's not that hard.
Yeah.
It's just a tomato. So that's why we're trying to separate that out, so that we can eliminate our expectation they're going to eat it, which will eliminate the pressure.
Okay. So when you're exploring food, is that not at the dinner table? Like, is that a separate activity, or does it matter?
It depends on you and your family. So you can do it at the dinner table if it's not getting confused with eating. But if it is getting in the way, then maybe you should do it some other time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And now I feel like I have so much more to learn from you, and I'm guessing that everyone in the audience is feeling the same way, but we can't talk forever, unfortunately. No. But you have an amazing book called It's Not About the Broccoli. Tell people just a little bit, like, what are we going to learn in that? And we will be sure to link to that book too anywhere we share this video.
Yeah, so it's just that covers in detail the whole problem with thinking about nutrition first and how you switch to the habits mindset and then how you implement it, how you solve picky eating, how you can deal with an undereater or an overeater. It's not that long a book, by the way, and it's easy to read, I think.
So just taste it, just try it, just read a page, you'll like it. I
There
hear
you
you, I hear
go.
you.
If you want to read that mystery novel that you really love as the dessert, then you have to eat your vegetables, which is my book first.
I love it. I love it.
It's available wherever books are sold. I don't sell that on my website because it's published by Perigee, which is an imprint of Penguin. So
Yep.
they're in charge of that. But if you buy it someplace, please write a review because that really helps.
Absolutely. Well, goodness, thank you so, so much, Dina Rose, for being here today. I'm humbled and honored by just all your knowledge and 20 years of experience and these amazing structures that you shared with us. And I know, like my poor kids, my husband says, every time you do one of these interviews, you try to change something in our house. And I'm like, I know, we're improving.
I know. We have that same problem in my house.
Yeah. So I'll get to talk to my kids about this. But I feel pretty good that at least a lot of what we're doing, is in the right direction. And usually when we talk about food, I try not to do good and bad, but
Right.
we do talk about, like, we will Google, oh, how many grams of sugar are kids supposed to have in a day? That's been our most recent exploration. And then we start adding it up and my big kids are like, oh boy, that's not very much. I mean, that's what should be the little cookie next to the plate,
Right.
probably your
Right.
24 to 30 grams of sugar. Ooh, dog, that adds up
Very easily. Yep.
really fast. Well, thank you again for being here, Dina, and Kids Cook Real Food listeners. Come on back next week for another episode of the Healthy Parenting Connector, where we connect parents who really, really, really want to raise healthy children who eat their broccoli but understand that candy is in there too, with the experts who have the information they need. Thank you.